Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Kerbel here, and I'm really, I'm really sad to miss my reading with Parks class. Because it's a Wednesday, and Wednesday after lunch, I'm always going to read with Parks class. But the good thing is we've got Google Classroom and our YouTube video. So I've got my book, Benjamin Zephaniah, Windrush Child. I'm going to read it, and then hopefully we'll be able to put it on our Google Classroom. So the thing is, in the story so far, there was a little boy called Leonard, and he lived in Jamaica, and he loved Jamaica. It's 1958, so that's quite a long time ago. And his dad is in England. His dad is a bus driver. He's living with his mum and his grandma, and his dad has sent money to Jamaica so that Leonard and his mum can come join dad in England. But Leonard's really, really sad because he's going to have to leave his grandma. He's going to have to leave Jamaica, which he loves. So he started his journey. He's got on the bus and he's left Maroon Town where they live, and he's arrived in Kingston. They stayed overnight in Kingston, and now it's the morning of April the 13th, 1958, and he's just looked up and he's seen the biggest thing he's ever seen in his life, and that thing is a ship. And this is chapter 6. I stood on the harbour looking up at the ship, and I couldn't believe how big it was. It was taller than any building I've ever seen, mainly black and white at the top. It was so big it partly blocked out the light. The front third of the ship had a big open deck and the rest was covered. We waited in the long queue. It felt as if we were queuing for hours. The woman in front of us could not stop talking. She had 2 children with her, but she wasn't talking to them. One of the children, a girl, looked towards the ship expressionless, as if she didn't want to be there. I knew how she felt. The other, a slightly older girl, had her eyes fixed on her mum. I glanced up at my mum, but her eyes were fixed firmly on the queue in front, and I could tell she was determined not to miss a step. It looked like she couldn't even breathe until we reached the desk at the front of the queue. "Mum," I said under my breath and pulling at her hand. "Mum, who's she talking to?" "Just mind your own business, son," replied Mum. The woman was loud, but I couldn't understand why people around us were acting as if she wasn't there and carrying on as normal. "But she's being so loud. Who's she talking to?" "Jesus," said Mum. "She's talking to Jesus." We didn't go to church, but we prayed sometimes, and I'd never seen someone praying when waiting in a queue before. She's not eating. She's not going to sleep. She hasn't even got her eyes closed. Can you talk to Jesus like that? "The Lord moves in mysterious ways," Mum replied, "and so do people. Now, just quiet and mind your own business." Finally, we reached the desk, and a big white man snatched a book that my mum was holding from her hand. His face was rigid and unfriendly. He wore a dark blue uniform with a cap of the same color. At the front of the cap, there was what looked like 2 leaves, a gate and a crown. I hoped that not all white men were as stern and serious as him. He stamped my mum's book, gave it back to her, and shooed us on. I turned and asked my mum who he was. "Him is a customs officer. Him work for the Queen of England, and when you see people like him, you must show them respect." My mum was the only queen I knew. Indeed, her and my grandma were the only people on the earth who I truly respected. I couldn't understand why everything had become so stiff all of a sudden. Mum seemed nervous. She was rigid and looked uneasy. We walked for a while, and then when we came to the stairs that went up to the ship. "Wow, it's so big." "Is this the Empire Windrush?" I asked, feeling excited. "No," said Mum. "The ship called a Rosa Star." I noticed my mum holding onto a little blue book. "What's that book?" I asked as we were walking up the steps. "That is my passport," she replied. She opened it and I could see a photo of her. "Where's my passport?" I asked, feeling slightly annoyed and a little jealous. "You don't need one," she said. "But why do you need one and I don't?" "The British government have said that you can't have one." "Why not?" I persisted. "Because you're too young. I am British and therefore so are you." "But I am me and you are you. I should have my own passport, shouldn't I?" I stopped halfway up the steps, blocking the way so that a queue of people formed behind me. "Stop asking so many questions," Mum said, taking my hand and tugging so that I'd keep walking. My passport is our passport. It promises us protection and the freedom to travel in all British territories, all over the world. That's what the Queen says. And if that's what the Queen says, that's the way it is. And that's all you need to know. I stopped again, staring at the blue book. It looked important, and I wanted to feel important. I reached up and tried to pull my mum's passport from her hands, but she held it firmly. She frowned as she spoke to me, creating angry lines on her forehead. Stop it now. You're not to touch this, okay? If we lose this, then we can't ever see your dad again. Do you understand? So leave it. It was not very often I saw my mum so angry. And when she was, I used to go for a walk in the bush while I went to Grandma. Now there was nowhere to go, and Grandma wasn't there. At the top of the stairs on the open deck, Mum put the suitcase down and took a couple of deep breaths. There was another white man. He had a kinder face. He was dressed in a smart black uniform, but there was no crown on his cap. His had a small ship on it. I think he could see I was close to crying, and Mum was tired, so he smiled at me and bent down to hand me a piece of paper. Do you need a hand with that suitcase, ma'am? He asked. No, said Mum. I'm okay. Then the man spoke to me. Now cheer up, little man, he said. You're going to be fine. You see that paper there? I nodded, and he continued. Well, on that paper, you'll see the number of your cabin. It's a good cabin. He pointed to some large doors. Just go through those doors, up the stairs to the second floor, and your cabin's starboard. That means on your right. And it's got a view, especially for you. You can see the sea day and night, and sometimes you can see other ships going by. Now, that's not bad, is it? I nodded again. Right, he continued. This is a great ship. So you'll have a good journey. I'll tell you what, if you don't have a great journey, I'll eat my hat. I could still feel the tears threatening to spill, but I smiled at the thought of him eating his hat. Thank you, I said. It's my pleasure, little man. We went to the second floor, and as we made our way along the corridor, I asked my mum why the second man didn't look at her passport. He doesn't work for the Queen. He works on the ship, she replied. What does it say on the paper? I opened it up and read the words written there. Cabin 323. We walked around looking, and finally we reached our cabin. It was small. In one corner it had a tiny bathroom with a shower with warm water. The walls were paper thin, and when the woman on one side coughed, we could hear it as if she was in our room. On the other side there was a couple with a very small baby. I heard the baby crying, and it sounded like we were in one room altogether, but they must have been thinking that we sounded like we were in their room. The only difference was that I was no crybaby. But just like the nice man who worked on the ship said, we had a window. And when I climbed on the bed and looked through the window, I could see the sea, and the sea went on forever. As I looked out into the sea, Mum started to take things out of the suitcase. When she'd done as much as she wanted to do, she lay on top of the bed. She was looking quietly at the ceiling. I was looking quietly at the sea until we heard the engine start up with a big rumble and voices shouting outside. Ship a-leave! We a-leave now! Forward to England! Mum jumped up off the bed and with much excitement said, Come, Leonard, come, we go. I followed her downstairs to the deck, where it looked as if all the passengers had gathered. They were all talking and waving to the people on land. Mum's face lit up. Her mood changed and she was smiling. She found a place where we could see the people on the land. Wave, she said. Wave to the people. I had no idea who I was waving to, but I did as my mum had said and waved. People were waving back, so I waved more, and we didn't stop until our arms were heavy. The ship slowly began to pull away, and the people on deck started to go to their rooms. We returned to our cabin, and I went back to the window where I could watch the people on land going away, and the land getting smaller and smaller. Mum was lying on the bed again. She looked tired, but I had to ask, why were we waving to people we didn't know? They are Jamaicans, son, and we're leaving them, she said. But we're not just waving to them. We're waving to the country. We're saying goodbye to Jamaica. And that's the end of chapter 6. So hopefully we'll have a chance to read again soon for chapter 7. Thank you, Parks class. Enjoy.